Alright, so this next video in the segment on the Gilded Age is going to focus on urbanization, or the growth of cities. And so the growth of cities and industrialization, they develop simultaneously as two sides of the same coin. As we see the shift in population from rural to urban become more obvious with each passing decade, it becomes more apparent the relationship between the growth of cities and the rise of industry. Cities provide a supply of labor for the factories, and they're also a principal market for these factory-made goods. And so by 1900, almost 40% of Americans lived in towns or cities. And by the 1920s, for the first time, more Americans lived in urban communities than in rural areas. Those moving into these cities were both immigrants and native-born Americans. And then in the late 19th century, you see the younger population of Americans move from the rural areas, and they're leaving these farms because they're deciding that the cities or the urban areas, those are the places to seek new economic opportunities. And we will also touch on some of the amusements or the attractions that the city has to offer that the farms don't. And so when these younger people leave the farms for industrial and commercial jobs, a few of them ever return back to the farm. Among those who joined this movement from farms to cities were also African Americans from the South. And when we talk about the early part of the 20th century, we'll talk about something called the Great Migration, which is essentially this movement of African Americans from the southeastern part of the United States to the northern and western cities. And so as we see this population boom and this shift in the population from rural to urban, we see the cities of the 19th century undergo significant changes. Once again, not only to their size, but to their internal structure and design. So some of the things that we see here, some of the changes that we see. The first thing that we see is the number of improvements in urban transportation. This is going to make the growth of cities possible. In the pre-Civil War era, in the walk-in cities era, people had little choice but to live within walking distance of their shops and their jobs. But these cities gave way to what's called streetcar cities in the late 19th century, in which people lived in residences many miles from their jobs, and they were able to commute to work on horse-drawn streetcars. And by the 1890s, these horse-drawn cars were being replaced by electric trolleys, elevated railroads, subways, and these could transport people to urban residences even farther away from the city's commercial center. And so you almost see, I guess you could say this is like the very, 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 very beginnings of the urban sprawl and the suburbs, which we'll really talk about more in the 1950s. The building of massive steel suspension bridges, such as the Brooklyn Bridge, also made possible for longer commutes between residential neighborhoods and the center city. Mass transportation did have the effect on segregating urban workers by income. You see a lot of the upper and middle classes move to the streetcar suburbs to escape pollution, poverty, and crime of the city. And so you see this exodus of higher income residents left the older sections of the cities to the working poor, many of whom were immigrants. And once again, in the 1950s and 60s, we'll see a movement called the urban renewal, trying to clean up these cities. Some other changes to the cities that we see here, dealing with steel again, is that cities start to build or start to grow upwards. As cities expanded outward, they also soared upward, since increasing land values in the central business district dictated the construction of taller and taller buildings. In 1885, for instance, you see the first skyscraper being built in Chicago. It's 10 stories, believe it or not, and it's the Home Insurance Company building. Structures of this size were possible by such innovations as the Otis elevator, the central steam heating system with radiators in every room, and by 1900, steel frame skyscrapers for offices of industry and commerce have replaced much of the church spires as a dominant feature of American city skylines. I talked to you in the last video about ethnic neighborhoods or ethnic ghettos, and as you see, the upper middle classes desert residences near the business district. The poor moved into them. And then as people saw that more and more of the poor were coming to the city's center, to increase their profits, landlords started to divide up inner city housing to these small windowless rooms. This resulted in slums and something called dumbbell tenement apartments. They call it dumbbell tenements because if you looked at them from a bird's eye view, they look like a dumbbell that you would find in the gym. And these apartments could cram over like 4,000 people in one city block. And, these, like I said, these families were often, living in one room. Everybody on the one floor had to share one bathroom. A lot of these, tenements, apartments had no windows. That means poor ventilation, no sunlight. And so you see that, there are some attempts to fix this in the late 19th century. In fact, in like 1879, the New York City, the New York City Council passed a law that required each bedroom to have a window. And so you see, okay, we have to have a window. We'll get around this with ventilation shafts in the center of the building to provide windows for each room. However, that doesn't stop the overcrowding, that doesn't stop the filth, and that doesn't stop the spread of deadly diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. We'll talk a little bit more about the exposure of the poor living conditions in these ethnic ghettos with Jacob Riis and his book called How the Other Half Lives. In the next, I guess you could say, in the next video segment, we'll look at some of the things such as Jacob Riis and How the Other Half Live, and some of these other reform movements that are awakened, as a result of the changes that were going on in the city.